Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the debriefing after the third BEREC plenary of this COVID-19 marked BEREC year. As you know, notice and are very much aware, we are not having physical meetings, unfortunately, but we hope that this debriefing meeting with all of you today will meet the purpose we have of informing you of our activities. Yes, so that's the cover picture there, and I can have the next slide, please, to start with. I will first present to you the agenda of today and some of the main events from the meeting, and then I will, of course, as usual, hand over to a number of the co-chairs who will present matters that we discussed and present those to you later on. So the first item on the agenda will be, very importantly, the information about the election of the BEREC Chair for 2022 and for Vice Chairs for next year, 2021. And you will also get from me some information about the new public consultations and the running of those consultations. Then Michel will come in and present the BEREC work program for 2021, followed by a presentation on the response that we handed in to the European Commission recently on the digital services package and the act presented by the court, by the Commission, sorry. Then we will have fixed network evolution co-chairs talking about the guidelines on high capacity networks. And then we will actually have a 15-minute Q&A session. We have received some questions prior to this meeting. Thank you very much for submitting those. Anyone who has not submitted any questions so far but have questions, please use the chat function to indicate your questions, and I will get to them in due course. After that first break for a question, we will have the Open Internet co-chairs to explain the report on the implementation of the Open Internet Guidelines, followed by a presentation on intra-EU communication from the roaming co-chairs as well. Then remedies co-chairs will have an update on the input to the access recommendation, and we will finish up with a second Q&A session at the end of the program. So if I can have the next slide, please. First point of order is to present you, as I said, with the elected members for BEREC, which is, of course, is very important. We had the elections, as I said, last week. For the first time ever, we had them in fully electronic format, very positive experience. And we ended up having elected Mrs. Annemarie Sipkes from the ACM, the Netherlands, for the post of BEREC Chair for 2022. And as additional vice chairs for 2021, we have two BEREC vice chairs elected. First, Mrs. Alejandra Iturriaga de Candini, I think that's the pronunciation, from the CNMC in Spain. And then the second vice chair is Mr. Jesmond Bugeja, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Maltese Communication Authority, both for next year, a one-year election in both cases. And then finally, we also elected Dr. Rainer Schnepfleitner, who is the Director of the Office for Communication in Liechtenstein, as a representative at the BEREC mini board for the participants without voting rights who take part in BEREC's work. Again, congratulations to all the elected officials, and I look forward very much to working with all of you next year as outgoing chair under Michel's chairmanship. Now, Public consultations, you have the usual table there on the screen in front of you. There are 2 items that were adopted for public consultation. We will very soon hear more about the draft work program from Michel. And then we have the guidelines on geographical service. Both, as usual, will be launched with today's date as the launch date, and the closing date in both cases is in 30 days' time, that is to say the 5th of November 2020. We believe that you are fully able to handle those 2 consultations in parallel. So, of course, we look forward very much to receiving any and all information that you want to share with us on those 2 documents as we go along. And with that, I will hand over the presentation to Michel Van Bellinghen, our incoming chair, who will present the work program for public consultation. And then we will hand over as we go along to the co-chairs I mentioned, and then I'll come back at the Q&A point. Thank you. Michel.
Thank you very much, Dan, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real honor for me to present to you this draft work program 2021 we adopted during the last plenary last week. And as you have already seen, after this public debriefing, we will launch the draft work program for public consultation until the 5th of November. The next slide, please. Yes, thank you very much. So this is just to remind you the process so far. We had a webinar instead of a physical stakeholder forum in April, as you probably remember, and we have launched an early call for input, which was real successful. We received a lot of excellent ideas, and thank you very much for that. And as you can see, in December, we will adopt the final work program. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So this gives you an overview of the structure of this draft work program. The objectives of BEREC's works in 2021 are aligned with the BEREC strategy 2021-2025, and this is divided into the 3 high-level strategic priorities you find on the slide, but also with the priorities set up for institutional and international cooperation, as well for the EU mandatory work stemming from legal instruments, and finally about the stakeholder engagement and suggestion for the following work program for 2022. Next slide, please. Thank you. So BEREC activities have mainly been focused on meeting its obligation under the code by developing guidelines this year. And in 2021, much of BEREC's work will shift from issuing guidelines towards assessing future technological market developments, especially related to end-user provisions with the scope of electronic communications and the digital ecosystem. The facilitation of successful implementation, consistent application of the code, and the focus on sustainability will be important horizontal principles that remain high on the radar of our overall work next year. An additional key objective is to ensure that very high capacity networks and 5G services are available in a timely manner. We're mindful of what is still needed to achieve the gigabit 25 objective, and we will continue to promote the rollout of fiber and 5G. In this fast-moving digital environment, BEREC sees its crucial to track developments within the electronic communication sector and adjacent sectors. And in this slide, as you have already seen, we will continue to deepen our expertise in digital platforms regulation, and we will further develop our understanding of the contribution we can make into limiting the impact of the digital sector on the environment. Looking beyond our own work items we put forward, we also observe that 2021 will become a loaded year for the European institutions, especially in the field of electronic communications and digital policy. The Commission is currently preparing several new legislative initiatives like DSA and the Green Deal, but the Commission is also reviewing a high number of legislative instruments like the roaming regulation, the broadband costs reduction directive, the access recommendation, the recommendation on 5G and IS directive, the recommendation on relevant markets. For all that, BEREC stands ready to provide its independent advice to the co-legislators and the Commission based on our long-standing experience in the sector of electronic communications and ex-ante regulation. We plan to issue an opinion regarding the broadband cost reduction directive, the review of the access recommendation, and to provide input regarding the review of the roaming regulation and the potential review of the EU state aid guidelines as required. We will also stand ready to support the Commission, ENISA, and the IS Cooperation Group on security issues related to electronic communications networks. We realize that the workload is ambitious, but we try to keep the balance between the different strategic high-level priorities and between the different working groups. By this last item about breaking down the silos, this is another objective because we know that there are many moments of interactions with stakeholders, this public debriefing, for instance, but also public consultations and workshops, for instance, to collect stakeholders' view on different aspects related to backhaul regulation, on the impact of 5G on regulation, on digital platforms, and on the internet value chains. Sometimes stakeholders will be given an opportunity to give an early input before the drafting starts. Breaking down the silos also refers to cross-cutting work streams, for example, 5G, which would benefit from collaboration between the different working groups, and also to the development of a strategy for relations with the other institutions. And indeed, promoting deeper collaboration, both internally as well as externally, will be increasingly valuable and necessary, especially in the context of regulatory issues with horizontal impacts related for instance, the internet value chain, the development of 5G, network security, and adapting competition rules to a digital platform economy. To that end, we envisage to develop a midterm strategy for relations with other institutions. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. This is my last slide about the Stakeholder Forum. So lastly, it's my pleasure to invite you all to this BEREC Stakeholder Forum, which will be moderated by Mr. Philippe Deframe from Cologne International, and it will take in 2 weeks' time on the 19th of October from 2 to 5 p.m. And again, given the current circumstances, we have decided to organize a virtual forum like we did in April. But this time, the forum will be kicked off with an introductory remark by the European Commissioner for Internal Markets, Mr. Thierry Breton, and I will be providing you more explanations about the work program for next year. The current chair, my estimated colleague Dan, will elaborate on perspectives on the electronic communications in handling the COVID-19 crisis. And the first part of that event will wrap up with the Q&A session. For that session, the newly elected BEREC Chair for 2022, my estimated colleague Annemarie, will also join us. And we hope for a lively interaction with you. And may I use this occasion to remind you to send in any question in advance to press@berec.europa.eu, not later than 15 October, close of business, please. The second half of the forum will focus on regulation of digital platforms, focusing on the regulatory issues and collaboration between regulators. The global competition of law and policy professor at George Washington University Law, William Kovacic, will give a keynote speech. And afterwards, the discussion on the regulation of digital platform will follow with the distinguished speaker, Ursula Park from BEOC, Benedict Blumeyer from Allied for Startups, Kay Yebeli from CCA Europe, Luc Indricks from ECTA, and Liz Fur from Ethno. And Matthew Newman from MLEX will moderate this panel discussion. On the day of the event, the live streaming of the BEREC Stakeholder Forum will appear on the front page of the BEREC webpage approximately 10 to 15 minutes before start of the event. And so I hope to see you all there. With that, I hand over the floor to Chiara to present the BEREC response on the Digital Services Act and the new competition tool. Over to you, Chiara.
Thank you very much, Michel. So yes, we are presenting the response of BEREC to the DSA package. On the next slide, please. We are presenting the main lines of the response, and then we will go a bit more into details. So first of all, the regulatory framework that we are proposing for digital platforms is inspired by the ECS ex-ante asymmetric regulation and adapted, of course, to the specificities of digital platforms. So we are proposing an asymmetric regulation because we are only aiming at digital platforms with significant intermediation power, so what we call SIP. And we also refer to digital platforms and not only to online platforms, because we are also recognizing that some issues are raised by operating systems, which are not strictly considered online, but still should be in the scope of the intervention in our mind. And this intervention is also built on the experience and expertise that we have in regulating ECS market in order to address both structural competition problems, protect end user rights, and keep the digital environment open and competitive. So we recognize that with the framework that we know in telco, we can reach a variety of objectives which go also beyond competition-related problems. We are proposing for the intervention a combination of options 3A and 3B of the DSA Inception Impact Assessment, meaning that there is, on the one hand, principle-based general prohibitions and obligations, and on the other hand, some tailored remedies, which would be applied on a case-by-case basis and, of course, would be proportionate. The regulatory framework that we are proposing is ensuring regulatory predictability and proportionality, also thanks to the fact that the scope and the thresholds for intervention are well-defined and set in advance, so are known. And on the other hand, we also think that proposing a consistent framework of intervention has many benefits because it creates repeated interactions with the stakeholders and also tackling then obvious information asymmetries which are present in these markets, and also proposing a coherent and consistent reach of different objectives, as I was mentioning before, and which is something that we already know in telco. And the next slide, please. So, as I said, we are focusing on digital platforms with significant intermediation power, and this SIP would be active in predefined areas of business, which could be, for example, search, social networks, OS, and which are characterized by some structural features. So, for example, strong network effects, high barriers to entry, high switching costs, and significant economies of scale and scope. These digital platforms would present some structural and specific criteria, like, for example, the control over digital bottlenecks and or the fact of being an unavoidable trading partner for business users. They would have strong financial resources and, most importantly, easy and privileged access to capital markets, and also would be organized into ecosystems, which means that they could use this power that they have also to leverage it on additional services and businesses quite easily, and also to gain the control over more key inputs and assets, so reinforcing this significant intermediation power. This the SIP identification, so how to identify these digital platforms with SIP, we propose two ways. The main one is based on absolute thresholds for each areas of business, which would be defined at the EU level. It would be like in a EU legal act. And the second one, we also recognize that sometimes there may be platforms who do not reach these absolute thresholds, which are defined at the EU level, but still are exerting significant intermediation power. And in this case, we are proposing also an optional identification process, which is done after an individual assessment, and it can be at the EU, regional, or national level. Next slide, please. So concerning the intervention itself, as I mentioned, it would be a combination of two different interventions. So on the one hand, it could be with principle-based general obligations, for example, transparency, and prohibition. So, for example, unjustified discrimination among business users, which would be applicable to all digital platforms with SIP, but then would be adjusted according to the specificities of the areas of business. So, of course, the rules, obligations concerning OS could not be the same as concerning another business, like, for example, search. So they would be adapted, but they would be principle-based and general. And as we mentioned, it would be asymmetric. So even the general rules would be still applied only on the digital platforms which are recognized as having a significant intermediation power. For the remedies, they would be case by case and proportionate. So it could be access, for example, to key inputs like data or key assets like technical functionalities. And this would have to ensure that there is a level playing field for both competitors and also providers of complementary services and goods. Or it can also be access to the overarching digital environments that these platforms are controlling. So, for example, the fact that sometimes these platforms are limiting the end users' rights to access or share content and applications, and this should also be taken into account. So not only accessing inputs and assets for business users, but also for end users at large. And then there may be also other specific issues which may need a tailored intervention. And in this case, some remedies could be designed in order to tackle these issues. Next slide, please. So what we are doing is also proposing an institutional model, which we think could work and could be successful. And it's based on competencies and expertise, which is already existing in the competent authorities at the EU or national levels. And this institutional design is based on a strong coordination between the European and the national levels. It is depending on the geographical scope of the problems identified. So it can be at the EU level, or it could be at the national level or an intermediate level when there are a few countries which are involved. The bodies which would be involved at the EU level, it would be an EU body that could be potentially the European Commission. Then we think that it would be like an advisory board at the EU level would also be needed, and it could be what we know, for example, at BEREC, which has proved to be successful. And then there would be a role also for competent national regulatory bodies. The issues, if they are pan-European, they would be addressed by this EU body in cooperation with the advisory board and the national regulatory bodies. These national regulatory bodies would be in charge of the enforcement, dispute resolution at the national level, data collection, monitoring, national cases, and so on. So we recognize that there is a role also for national bodies. But this role for national bodies, of course, needs to be coordinated at the EU level. And there is an advisory board, which is a point of coordination among this national regulatory body, who is ensuring consistency, guidelines, common position, data aggregation, and supporting both national and the EU bodies. As I said before, we know this has been successful and it works at BEREC. And we think that the regulatory intervention towards digital platforms can be based on this valuable expertise. And BEREC and the ECS and NRAs are well placed to take over the roles of these two bodies at the national and the European level. And I think that's all on my side, so I can give the floor to Wilhelm. Thank you very much.
Hello, welcome from my side. Good afternoon. The title of the presentation is BEREC Guidelines on Very High Capacity Networks, Outcome of the Public Consultation. Next slide, please. The draft BEREC Guidelines on Very High Capacity Networks were approved for public consultation at Plenary 1 this year. The public consultation ran from 10th of March until 13th of April, and in total, BEREC received 34 contributions. Main result. The stakeholder mainly made comments on the criteria a network has to fulfill in order to be considered a very high capacity network. Several stakeholders explicitly agree with the criteria. The others made comments on many different aspects. Criterion 1, which is in a network providing a fixed line connection with a fiber rollout at least up to the multi-dwelling building, needs to be considered a very high capacity network. 6 stakeholders made comments on criterion 1. 5 of them explicitly agree with criterion 1. The other disagrees with provisions in the European Electronic Communications Code, EECC, not with the guidelines. The response is no need to adapt the guidelines. Criterion 2, which is in a network providing a wireless connection with a fiber rollout up to the base station, needs to be considered a very high capacity network. 9 stakeholders made comments on criterion 2. 2 of them explicitly agree with criterion 2. 5 suggest some adaptations. 1 disagrees with provision in the European Electronic Communications Code, and 1 disagrees with criterion 2. The response is the term very high capacity network is already defined in the EECC, and criterion 2 follows directly from this definition. Therefore, there is no need and possibility to change it. Next slide, please. Thank you. Criterion 3, which is in a network providing a fixed line connection, which is capable of delivering, under usual peak time conditions, services to the end user with a certain quality level, needs to be considered a very high capacity network. 30 stakeholders made comments on criterion 3. 4 stakeholders explicitly agree with criterion 3. 2 stakeholders, the worldwide standardization body for cable networks and the major vendor, explicitly confirmed that cable networks can meet the performance levels of criterion 3. The topics of the other stakeholders differ. Main topics are 5 stakeholders disagree, and 1 stakeholder explicitly agrees with the best technology approach taken in the guidelines. The response is, according to the EECC, criterion 3 needs to be based on the achievable end-user quality of service and therefore based on the best access technology deployed in the multi-dwelling building. 1 stakeholder suggested that the network performance up to the multi-dwelling building should be considered, not including the access network. The response is, the need to consider the end-user quality of service followed directly from the EECC. The proposed approach would have the result that the legacy network with the fiber rollout solely up to the local exchange and not closer to the end user would have to be considered a very high capacity network, which is not in line with the intention of the EECC. 2 stakeholders suggested to define peak time condition in order to make criteria 3 unambiguous. The response is, the guidelines have been adapted and now include also the definition of the term peak time. Criterion 4, which is any network providing a wireless connection which is capable of delivering, under usual peak time conditions, services to the end user with a certain quality level needs to be considered a very high capacity network. 7 stakeholders made comments on criterion 4. One stakeholder explicitly agreed with criterion 4. The topics of the comments of the other stakeholders differ. Main topics are. Several topics are the same and therefore also the BEREC response as in case of criterion 3. One stakeholder suggested higher performance thresholds in order to contribute to the broadband targets for 2025, and another stakeholder suggested lower performance thresholds in order to be consistent with the Commission's communication to the gigabit society. The response is, the term very high capacity network is already defined in the ECC, and criterion 4 follow this definition. One stakeholder suggested that microwave backhaul should also be possible. The response is, criterion 4 applies to any network providing a wireless connection and therefore also to networks with a microwave backhaul. Next slide, please. Thank you. The stakeholders made also comments on other parts of the guidelines. Example of main topics are: how can the NRA determine whether criteria 3 or 4 are fulfilled if the network doesn't have to offer a service which meets these criteria? The response is, the guidelines have been adapted and now make clear that the NRA may demand that a test service is implemented in the network. One stakeholder demanded that the quality of service parameter needs to be in line with the BEREC guidelines on net neutrality. The response is, the speed parameters defined in the BEREC guidelines on net neutrality do not refer to under usual peak time condition. Therefore, they cannot be used in the guidelines and criteria 3 and 4 cannot be based on them. I thank you for your attention and I hand back over to Dan for the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Wilhelm. Thank you very much for all the presenters of this first part of the debriefing. We will now go into the first Q&A session. So if you have questions and you have not yet submitted them, this is a good time to do so if the questions relate to the presentations we have seen so far. I have 4 questions that I have had sent to me that I'm going to address now, or I will address 2 of them and I will transfer 2 of them to our co-chairs from the MEA working group. And the first question I'm going to say something on is one where we don't really have much update. There was a question submitted where is the status of the BEREC work on the impact of 5G on regulation, and more specifically, are we looking deeper beyond the industry verticals into more general wholesale access and so on? And I think we don't really have an update there. This is still ongoing work, and we don't have anyone on this debrief today from the responsible working group. So you have to be patient with us, and we'll get back to that at a future occasion. And the second question I'm going to take myself is, what would be the timing for the BEREC opinions on the delegated regulation of FTRs and MTRs, and the recommendation on relevant markets? And there, of course, the work we're doing on those Commission acts is, it has a deadline from Commission, which is the 15th of October. So that was relatively clear-cut on that. And then I have 2 questions, as I announced, for MEA. I think MEA co-chairs probably have seen this. I will read them out for anyone else who follows the Q&A. We don't have the opportunity to display them at this stage, unfortunately. So the first question I'm going to address to you is in the list we have indicated as number 6 for you to prepare, Jorge and Chiara. And it reads, regarding BEREC's opinion on the draft EC recommendation on relevant market, will this include comments on market 1 and 2, wholesale fixed and mobile call termination, and especially on preserving NRA's ability to regulate aspects other than the euro rates, for example, pricing for interconnection, ports and links, non-discrimination on pricing below the euro rates. And I'll ask you to address that one first.
Hello, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for the question. Well, as Dan has said, I think that you will see the BEREC opinion on this in around 10 days. It is still work in progress, but of course very advanced work. So going to the question, for sure on the elimination of markets 1 and 2 of the list of relevant markets, BEREC is concerned and raise comments and analyze all the issues related with different issues, not only for prices for ancillary services, but also on non-price remedies. You will see our concerns, proposals for the Commission on how to address these issues. Both in some aspects will be in the delegated acts, other aspects will be in the opinion on relevant markets, as told by Dan. Both will be published at the same time. And yes, as told you, BEREC is concerned on that issue. That is not as simple as that there will be a euro rate, so directly there is nothing to regulate, because there are many different issues that some of them can be addressed in one way, others in another way, and we are raising the issues, and of course we are aware of that.
Thank you, Jorge. There's one question that just came into the chat. I think that is probably for Wilhelm. You may want to prepare for that. I'll read the second question we had in the before the meeting for Jorge and Chiara, which is number 3 in the list I have. BEREC is currently working on the report on digital platforms to be published next year, in which the outline ex-ante framework will be elaborated and explained in further detail. Can BEREC specify when this report will be published and indicate whether the report will focus on the commercial practices of some major handset manufacturers who deliberately limit the openness and interoperability of their operating system with certain mobile operators? And that is the view of the person raising the question, of course. So back to you, co-chairs, please.
Okay, thank you once more for the question. First of all, regarding the date for the publication of this report, this is a report we were preparing at the moment that the public consultation on the DSA appeared, and we had to shift it to be able to respond to the public consultation. And in principle, the report will be published for public consultation, so you will have the possibility to provide feedback to BEREC in the first quarter of next year. Okay, so February or so, March, it will be published. And the final publication is in principle scheduled. We still need to discuss internally in BEREC, but in principle it will be for the third quarter, of next year, taking into account feedback received. On if it will include issues on handsets and that issues on openness, etc. In principle, this will not be the report where we will address. We may address issues, but laterally, and but still we will address, and we will address in very more detail on a report we will prepare on the internet value chain. that it will be prepared together with the Open Internet expert working group. So it will be 2 groups in BEREC working on that. There will be workshops, so you will have even the possibility to raise these issues in advance and not reacting to a written report. And for sure, all issues related to handsets, etc., will be in the scope of the report because it is part of the internet value chain, and all the issues you are addressing on openness, etc. As told you, I mean, the Open Internet working group that has been working extensively in these issues will also be involved. So for sure we will address, but in that work stream that will be developed along next year. I don't know, Chiara or our colleagues from the other group, if they want to add anything.
Thank you very much, Jorge. I think we will leave the Open Internet Working Group for later. We have a presentation from them coming up. Wilhelm, have you had the time to look into the chat?
Yes. Yes, I have time to look at the chat. The answer is as follows. The term very high capacity network is already defined in the ECC, and the criteria defined in the guidelines follow and have to follow this definition. According to the criteria determined in the guidelines, any network with a fiber to the building or fiber to the home needs to be considered a very high capacity network. Networks on fiber to the building and fiber to the home are available in all EU countries, in some more, in others less, but they are not completely utopic, let's say, networks and already exist and qualify as a very high capacity. The situation is similar in case of wireless networks. Criterion 2 explicitly defines that any network with a fiber rollout up to the base station needs to be considered a very high capacity network. And this is also an approach that is rather commonly used in the EU countries. Therefore, also in this case, several networks will actually currently already qualify as a very high capacity network. The other part, with regard to performance thresholds, it needs to be noted that the EC clearly states that the performance targets need to be based on the performance which is achievable with a fiber rollout up to the multi-dwelling building or up to the base station. And for this reason, it was necessary to take as reference the best access technology deployed, and therefore the criteria are accordingly determined. So that's more or less the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilhelm. I have a second question for you that came in via email, which is one stakeholder who would like to have some reading instructions. Which are the main differences between the draft version and the final version of the guidelines?
Yes, BEREC does not publish usually references as track change versions, but you can have a look on the guidelines and you will see that the criteria did not really change. The main changes are that, as you will note when you read carefully the report on the outcome of the public consultation, the relation between the EECC and the BEREC guidelines was not fully clear. As also mentioned in the presentation, the term very high capacity is already defined in the EECC, and therefore also the guidelines have to follow this approach. This has been made more clear in a new paragraph in section 3 in the beginning, that the criteria follow directly from this definition. And the most other changes are to make more clear and avoid misunderstanding. The comments were very helpful because they showed to us that some paragraphs originally in the draft have potential to be misunderstood, and now for clarification, some explanations have been added. As mentioned before, for example, that the NRA explicitly may demand that the test service is implemented in the network in order to be able to verify whether the criteria are met or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilhelm. And to Luke, who wonders what prevents BEREC to publish track change versions, I think nothing prevents us from doing it. I think it's our choice not to do so. If you want to compare versions, I think it's everyone's choice to do so. Thank you very much for those questions. I will close the first Q&A session, and I will hand over now first to the Open Internet co-chairs, and I think it's Michel who will do the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Dan. So we will have 2 slides today. The next slide is on the 2020 Open Internet Implementation Report. We've changed the structure of this report because we felt it would be better to have an annex with a, if you like, recorded history. So it is not intended to be complete, but it has the most relevant topics of the past reporting periods in the annex now, so that you can see in the main body of the report the events that occurred in the reporting period. We have also included a chapter on COVID-19, since in the spring of this year we started the special reporting mechanism. These are brief reports, also to be found separately on the BEREC website. But we wanted to report on this in this report as well. The main message of that chapter is that the telecom operators did quite well in coping with the additional traffic load, since no traffic management or hardly any was necessary other than the regular traffic management. Some highlights on the rest of the report. I think overall it can be stated that NRAs are quite active on the subject of the open internet regulation. So the NRAs monitor the markets actively. That leads us to the knowledge of 26 member states having 0 rating offers. All but 3 NRAs also assessed traffic management practices, some formal, some informal. Also 26 NRAs have been active on looking into the transparency rules. So Article 4 concerning internet access products. We know now that 2/3 of the ISPs in the member states, or 2/3 of the member states, have markets where ISPs have included the required speed information. So that is still not all, but it is up from last year. Half of the NRAs have set additional specifications on how to inform on speed information in that national market. So I think this concludes the report. For the people that closer read the title of the report still reflects on the 2016 net neutrality guidelines and their applicability and their application, because those were the guidelines that were applicable during the reporting period. So next year we will refer to the updated guidelines. Then the next slide on the first judgment of the European Court of Justice on an open internet case. BEREC has had the opportunity to have a first analysis of this case, and we wanted to share some of the findings, or preliminary findings, if you like, with you. We find that the court confirms the current BEREC guidelines on several points. One of them is that the relation between Article 3.2 and 3.3 is in such a way that both sub-articles apply in parallel of each other. So there's no analysis under Article 3.2 required for Article 3.3 to be applied. In relation to that, the court confirms that end users cannot derogate from the Article 3.3, the traffic management rules, in a contract with a telecom company. We also find the court to confirm the definition we use on end user, so that includes what BEREC calls content application providers, so parties professionally sending data to end users, if you like. Then the assessment of traffic management restrictions after the data bundle has been depleted while the zero-rated data is continued to stream uninterfered. That is an example of not allowed management of traffic. That was the heart of this case. I think, and that's the last point on the substance, it's also important to note that the court does confirm a case-by-case assessment of zero-rating cases. So we have seen reports in social media that people have read this judgment in a way that it would prevent all zero-rating. That is not the way we read the court's text. Then what does this mean? Well, we know that there are 3 upcoming court cases on zero-rating or on open internet-related issues, probably with judgments later this year or in the next year. So there's still space to watch, if you like. But for now, we don't find a reason to start in, again, changing or updating the guidelines. And then that was what we planned to say. We had 2 questions from Ms. Lundqvist and Mr. Philippe Pardefoy, if I pronounce that correctly. So thanks for those questions. The questions were, has this court case been addressed in the implementation report? And the answer is no, because the reporting period predates the court's case or the judgment. And then the second question was, is the court having a more or less strict approach than the BEREC guidelines? And the court underlines the case-by-case analysis of zero-rating cases. So in that sense, I don't think one could state it's either more strict or less strict. So let's, if it would be different, then probably that will be shown in the following court cases. So I think that's the main message for now. Thank you. Then over to Elizabeth.
It's me, Joanna.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. Elizabeth couldn't join, unfortunately. So I will take this part of the presentation. So the recent plenary meeting adopted documents related to both international roaming and intra-EU communications. And next slide, please. So first, the document that was adopted was the update of BEREC Guidelines on intra-EU communications. Let me first give you let me first explain you briefly the key milestones. So in March 2019, BEREC issued its guidelines on intra-EU communication. At that time, due to the very strict time plan, no public consultation took place, but only a workshop. After almost 1 year of implementation, in March 2020, BEREC decided to update the guidelines and launched a public consultation. After analyzing the input received from 6 contributions, it published in October 2020 the final updated guidelines. The main changes is the update of the benchmark for sustainability procedures, some clarifications on the scope, and some clarifications on alternative tariffs. Next slide, please. The second document refers to the first BEREC intra-EU communications benchmarking report. This is the first report that BEREC issues on intra-EU communications, and it's based on data that it collected both from fixed and mobile operators. One of the main findings of the report is that according to the data collected, the regulation on intra-EU communication had little impact on average consumption for fixed call services and for SMSs. On the other hand, mobile call services average consumption has increased. The second finding is about average prices, which are well below the price caps for regulated voice services. More specifically, for mobile calls, the average EA retail price is 0.08 per minute, while the price cap is 0.19 per minute. While for fixed calls, the average EA retail price is 0.03 per minute, and again, the price cap is 0.19 per minute. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Coming now to the third document, which is the 25th roaming benchmarking report, which covers the period of the last quarter of 2019, the first quarter of 2020. What we see is that roam like at home data traffic is still increasing, but it flattens. We also see that wholesale prices continue to decrease and are well below the caps. And BEREC also notices that COVID-19 pandemic and travel restrictions seem to have slightly influenced Q1 2020 roaming traffic. We expect to see the full effect of COVID-19 on the consumption in the next data report. Thank you. I will now pass to Anne-Gret for the next presentation.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon. I just want you to update on our response to the targeted consultation on the review of the two access recommendations currently in force. So that is on the one side, we can go to the next slide. That is the 2010 NGA recommendation, and on the other side, the non-discrimination obligations and costing methodologies recommendation from 2013. And of course, you know, these two recommendations were built on the 2009 framework, basically, on the remedies according to Article 9 to 13 of the Access Directive, looking to foster the internal market, promoting investment in NGA, as well as promoting effective competition and innovation. And already the 2013 recommendation shifted the focus to look more on investment in newly deployed NGA networks. And now we have the code, and so we can see now in the next slide that the two recommendations need to be updated and aligned to the code. So, and of course also to the 2014 recommendation on relevant markets currently under review as well. You had heard already Jorge mentioning that BEREC is working on an opinion there. Generally, BEREC agrees with the update and the streamlining of the access recommendations, but we also consider it necessary to see that the EECC is here the starting point and also provides limits that need to be respected by the recommendations. So that is the, let's say, direction of thinking. And in particular, BEREC would highlight that if the code leaves a margin of discretion to NRAs, and the recommendations should not narrow this margin of discretion. And we also are pointing to the fact that we now have the new instrument of the BEREC Guidelines, formerly, of course, the common positions. And it is important that any now a new recommendation that might follow from this consultation, from this revision, should not be overlapping with BEREC Guidelines, but rather should be referred to and should be consistent with those. Because the BEREC Guidelines already provide quite a lot of guidance to NRAs for consistent application of the 2018 framework, and therefore it is important that this doesn't add, that the new recommendation, in case there is one, doesn't add another layer of guidance limiting and narrowing down the margin of discretion that the code provides to NRAs. That is, let's say, a strong message that we have here. And on the next slide, we would also like to highlight that we think, and that follows, of course, from the aspect that the code is the one that determines the direction of thinking, that the recommendations now must apply to all relevant markets susceptible to ex-ante regulation, not only like the 2013 recommendation to, for example, market 3A and 3B, or whatever their future name or number will be. So that is important here. And we also want to highlight with regard to the scope of the recommendations, because the questions were very much focused on VHCN, and of course that is in the focus. However, the code is broader and provides in the relevant articles that NRAs shall take into account of course, the objectives of the code, and related to the deployment of and take up of next generation networks of connectivity, and in particular very high capacity networks. So for us, it is clear that the scope of the future access recommendation should be broader and comprises the deployment of new and enhanced networks, in particular VHCN, but shouldn't be limited to the latter. And of course, we have heard Wilhelm explaining in detail the guidelines on very high capacity networks according to Article 82. And of course, any access recommendation should be fully in line with the BEREC guidelines on VHCN. This refers back to what I mentioned before. So that's about the scope. So applying to all markets, all relevant markets susceptible to ex-ante regulation, broader than just VHCN, even so, of course, we know that this is in the focus, but the code definitely is broader in the relevant articles 70 to 80, more or less 82, and therefore we think that this should apply also then to the recommendation. And as I said, they should be consistent with the BEREC guidelines on VHCN. With this, we can come to the next slide. As I mentioned already, we think it's important that rather than adding up other layers of guidance, the Commission's recommendation can refer to BEREC guidance documents, in particular, as I said, the BEREC guidelines, and more specifically, even the BEREC guidelines on VHCN. But there are also other BEREC guidelines coming up or already existing to which the access recommendation can refer to. So generally, we think that we caution against too detailed recommendations, as I outlined already, and we want to point out two things, and that is that recommends of the 2013 recommendation are now already included directly in the directive. Namely, in Article 70, you now have an explicit mentioning of EOI, and in Article 74, you have explicit mentioning of the ERT and the instrument, so to speak, of price flexibility to incentivize investment. These two aspects were formerly not included in the directive, in the access directive. They are now included directly in the code, and therefore we think that the recommendations and the number of recommendations that were in the recommends that were in the actual NDCM recommendation can be dropped or can be reduced because they are obsolete as they are already in the code and do not need, let's say, to have a new or additional definition or guidance. So generally in our response, which will of course also be made public and of course submitted to the European Commission by the deadline of 7th of October, so by tomorrow. We have in the individual responses to the individual questions, we have pointed to the parts of the recommendation of the two recommendations which are still relevant and are still useful also as guidance that can be transferred to a new or future access recommendation following the principles that I have tried to outline. So that's a quick overview of our thinking of the general principles, and you will see our responses to the questions and can follow up on those. So with this, I would like to hand back to Dan for the final session questions session. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all co-chairs for those presentations. And again, I remind everyone at the meeting that this is the time to indicate your questions in the chat function. I have two questions for the roaming group for Johanna. That I will read out now. I think you hopefully have seen them. It's questions 4 and 7 of the document we received. The first question is, does the 25th BEREC International Roaming Benchmark Data Report confirm that there is still room for the reduction of wholesale roaming caps? Interesting question.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, we've seen the question already. So our reply is that BEREC's conclusions that there is some room for the reduction of wholesale roaming caps, which was included in the 2019 opinion to the European Commission, was based on a very detailed analysis of wholesale costs, taking also into account actual wholesale rates. Further analysis of this proposal was also done in the 2020 input that BEREC submitted to the European Commission. The data included in the 25th benchmark report does not lead BEREC to come up with different conclusions than the ones that the documents of 2019 and 2020 include. So we can say that our conclusion remains the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. And then the second question is also relatively short and sweet. In the context of a review of the EU roaming regulation, we understand that the Commission has asked BEREC for further input. Can you please shed some light on this, indicating whether more is forthcoming?
Okay, thank you, Dan. As I previously mentioned, we have already issued our opinion in 2019 and in 2020, in particular in June 2020, we published our input to the European Commission's request for the preparation of the roaming legislative proposal. This input discusses the issues of the overall performance of the roaming regulation, the quality of service while roaming, value-added services for roaming, the sustainability of the regulation for all operators, M2M and 5G developments, and 112 enforcement. For the coming year, following the publication of the new legislative proposal, BEREC will actively participate in the process by providing inputs and opinions according to the relevant request that it will receive. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I notice no further questions in the chat function. I will now leave you all like half a minute to indicate any further final questions you have in the chat function. And if nothing is coming there fairly soon, I will wrap up this meeting, giving us all another 20 minutes or so to do something prior to the next item on our daily agenda. Now we have a question. Could BEREC comment on the foreseen activities with regard to cybersecurity, and notably in the context of the 5G cybersec recommendation? Well, we don't have the benefit of the ad hoc cybersecurity working group at this meeting. but I can say from my perspective that I know that we are in very active collaboration with all the other players in the development of 5G cybersecurity issues and the toolbox implementation, which of course is active at many levels. So I think we'll come back when we have more newsworthy items to present, but it's ongoing work, and the ad hoc group will remain there also for 2021. I can confirm that as well. Thank you, Oliver, for those additional questions. It is always an interesting one to follow, indeed. So, friends and colleagues, I think this has reached the time when I will thank you all for joining us for this this event, telling you what we did at the third plenary last week. It's always pleasant to have a stakeholder interaction, and thank you for joining us today. We will continue to connect with you in different ways, and most notably, as Michel mentioned earlier, I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible on the Stakeholder Forum a couple of weeks from now on the 19th of October. So thank you very much for today, and stay safe out there. Thank you. Bye-bye.